very much. The electronic intervention during John's talk was my fault because I asked for these side screens to be put down. So that was the comment on the student funding that that was being made. So I may get in the way of this one, but you'll be able to see the side ones. I think I'm wasting my time, to be honest. Everything that John said, I think, is what I want to say too. And it's great to hear that Derby is a university that aims to and has a community of professional practice. Whatever you may think of Levin Wenger, the people that, and their books and articles that came up with that phrase, I think we'd all agree that collaboration in the things that we're involved with is really important. And that's one of the headlines that I want to address today. So joint setting of goals, joint ambitions, and so on. You'll notice that my title, yes, I'm sorry, Dickens, Great Expectations. The title of the conference is Aspirations. And I was thinking about aspirations and expectations. Aspirations are about hopes and goal setting and so on. Expectations perhaps are more solid with very real expectations that goals will be hit. But there's a kind of a negative side to expectations as well, I think, that other people set expectations, for example, the QAA and their expectation of institution in terms of student engagement, whereas aspirations come from the self or the group. And who are we really talking about with these expectations or aspirations? Of course, we immediately think of students, yes, raising, as John was saying, raising the bar for them, but also for staff, also for institutions. And by staff, I don't just mean academic staff, I mean all the staff that are involved in universities, because they all have an effect on the student experience and student outcomes. And I think that's really important. And of course, managers too. So we live in interesting times. I've used Dickens's phrase of hard times. John used the phrase interesting times. The title of the conference is Times of Change. Yes, there are interesting times ahead, but they're full of opportunities as well as many problems. And I'd like to stress that. So you're obviously doing the right things here in Derby. And I picked out a few of the workshops today. One, for example, Hughes and Wilson. Shouldn't going to university feel good? Absolutely, it should feel good, and I think that's going to be an interesting workshop. I intend to squeeze into that one. So the affective side, the emotional side, is really important, as I'll comment in a second. Crick and Schofield, raising aspirations, raising achievement, students as collaborators in learning, and I think the collaborators side is something I want to stress as well. Marshall, Gibb, Gavin and Young, supporting international students, a peer mentoring approach, peer collaboration and so on. And then Higson, Walmsley and Smith, driving aspirations and learning through real-world case studies. And I think that notion of looking outside, it's used a lot in business, of course, but for everybody, looking at other practice, not to simply transfer practice from other institutions, other people and so on, but to think about how it can be adapted. And whenever I'm talking about change, I always talk about adaptation, not adoption. So context is really important, and that's another headline that I'd like to make today. That domestication, as it's sometimes called, to particular circumstances, is really important. So the talk then is based on really four. I'm drawing on four things. One is a 3-year evaluation that we did of a strategic development project in an English university funded by HEFKE, and they were wanting to really change the culture of the institution, and it was really interesting to watch them do that over the 3 years. Make it more engaged with employers, make it more flexible for students, and move from a fairly traditional and sometimes can't do culture to a can-do culture, and they were really successful in that. And they took on board some of the axioms, I suppose, that I'm going to be suggesting today, particularly about change. 2 projects on student engagement that Ruth kindly mentioned, one funded by the HEA, which was simply looking at all of the literature that we could find on student engagement, and believe me, there's a hell of a lot. Our summary was 20,000 words. And in fact, if you think about it, anything about student learning is about student engagement, so we had to kind of limit it. So that's out there. These slides, I'm sure, will be available afterwards, and all the references that I'll be making are there, and all the links and so on the final pages. Second one was funded by the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, and that was an empirical project looking at 3 universities in England, which seemed to be, from what we could tell, very good at engaging their students in different ways. And we interviewed leaders. This was about leadership, obviously, but leaders, and when I use leaders during this talk, I mean really anybody, because we're all leaders to some extent of some people in our classes and so on. So I'm not just talking about formal managers. And I am talking about student leaders as well as leaders of others. So some of the data I'll be giving you, and just a little bit, comes from that. And then a fourth and final source is the What Works project that Paul Hamlin and Hefke funded 22 institutions in 7 projects to look at widening participation and student success. And the reports are available on the web, but there's a kind of overview project called What Works, and I think that's really interesting, and it's worth looking at, the sort of overview of what those institutions found to work. And again, it kind of fits in with what I want to talk about today. As I say, it's on either side. So first of all, though, hard times, changing times, interesting times, whatever you want to call them. Yes, you can get depressed. Here's a list of things that are happening. Resources declining, expectations of staff being raised. But one word that I thought that John used was really interesting, was realistic expectations. And they are being raised, but they're being raised and raised and raised and raised, what's sometimes called the ratchet effect. You know, you get to that level, you meet those expectations, and then there's another set of expectations. And then there are multiple fields to be working in: research, teaching, finding money, and so on. So there's a question of role diversity and confusion. Marketization, again, John mentioned, he stole all my thunder, John mentioned marketization of higher education. And I think that's both an opportunity and a threat. I think it could go either way, and we have to think really carefully about what we do, both in the classroom and, you know, leading institutions and so on, to make that go in the way that we want to, and I'll come back to that in a second. The dangers of technical rational managerialism, and once again, John mentioned this in terms of the what the governing body said, meet your academic targets, and that is really unusual because normally it's about setting clear financial goals and so on, milestones towards a highly articulated objective, and it rarely works that way, as we found in the evaluation of the institution that I was talking about earlier on. People are people. They think differently, they develop little local cultures, they adapt to what works for them and so on. And then speed of response. What we've seen politically is requirements to act today, suddenly, and I think that's filtering down to all levels. So for example, currently we're looking at engaged in a funded project that's happening right now, looking back at Hefke's involvement in the enhancement of learning and teaching over the last 5 years, and seeing what went right and what went wrong with the things that Hefke did, and thinking about the future. Well, of course, we're talking to people in Hefke and to other key stakeholders. One of the things that we're hearing is something like the settles. If you don't know what they are, perhaps you're not from this country, they were the Centres for Excellence in Learning and Teaching set up around the country. That had £350 million devoted to the whole project over 5 years. And that money kind of suddenly appeared, and decisions had to be made almost, by tomorrow about what to do with it. The objective being to raise the status of teaching because research culturally is so important in institutions, and so teaching needed a helping hand. Great to have 350 million quid, but nice to be able to think for 6 months or so about what to do with that. And that so often happens in all spheres. Nice to get the money, but we would like to plan, please. So times are changing. Oh, I didn't mention the great electric interweb, a great phrase. Of course, that's also presenting opportunities and challenges. MOOCs, for example, are being promoted as the next big thing. Well, maybe not. Personally, I think not, but we'll see. As well as resources and all the things I've talked about, though, there are issues beyond that, and there's a very interesting book, I think still has great relevance, called Great Expectations and Mixed Performance by Cherich and Sabatier. 1986. 1986 was very similar in many ways. Thatcher's time, great cuts for universities and so on. Many of the same sorts of challenges. And based on empirical evidence around Europe, they identified a number of things that can assist with change or obstruct it. Adequacy of causal theory was one. What do people think about how change works? And for my money, and for others, that was one of the problems with the settles. You know, okay, you put centres for excellence in particular institutions, but what's the theory about how that changes the whole system? And really the evaluations are showing that. They didn't really have a great effect across the sector. There wasn't really a good causal theory of change there, and that's entirely necessary. Commitment to objectives. So, okay, you have aspirations or expectations, but stable commitment to them. And that's politically, that's one thing that we tend not to get. And if institutions jump to political tunes, then objectives change, aspirations change. Support institutionally and legislatively the whole framework of what's going on, the background of change. So you shouldn't see change just as one particular initiative. You need to see it in the framework of what's happening. And I'm sure many of you will agree that we tend to get really tired of the next initiative. So many initiatives going on at the same time. So if a new one is put into the mix, you think, oh, can I really find the personal resources to deal with this? So it is a time of increasing expectations. So the alternatives then that John's already spoken about. Absolutely, yes, we didn't consult beforehand. Students as partners, not seeing students as consumers of purchasers of a product, but partners. And in fact, just today I got an email about a new initiative, a HEFKI NUS initiative, a student engagement group that's just been set up, and they're actually advertising for people to be on that group. I think that's great. Students as partners, I'll come back to that in a second. Complex, adaptive, collaborative approaches, like the one taken in the university I was just referring to, allowing for messiness, allowing for risk, allowing innovation, and knowing that things will be different in different places on the ground. Things will turn out differently, so not to expect homogeneous outcomes because of the adaptation that I was talking about, rather than a technical, rational goal towards a vision, goalpost towards a vision, or milestones towards a vision. So smart, realistic, focused approaches, and a theory-based understanding of change, coming back to that Cherich and Sabatier thing about a causal theory. And for my money, social practice theory, it can tell us a lot here, and that in brief just says that if you think about change, you're really thinking about groups, call them communities of practice if you want, or whatever, who develop, as they work on a common project over time, they develop sets of meanings, they develop understandings, and they develop what the project is over time. And so you get a multiple cultural configuration. You get different cultures, different norms, different sets of practices, and so on. This perspective also focuses on tools, the tools that you use and the effect that they have on you, on your groups, as you work with them, and the effect that you have on them. So, for example, PowerPoint. We all probably hate it. We all hate PowerPoint karaoke. And it's been shown by studies to have effects on the way we think about things. You know, we start thinking in terms of bullet points and, you know, five things and so on. So it's actually PowerPoint as a tool affects our practices, but then our practices can also affect the use of tools. Mobile phones is a good example of that. The text function, it was put in, never thought it would be much used by the engineers who developed it, but they could do it, so they put it in, and it's created a whole, it's been used in particular unthought about ways because it happened to fit in some ways the practices. Okay, and I just want to quote here from the What Works project about these alternatives. They say, early engagement in the academic sphere, early engagement by students in the academic sphere, pre-entry, induction, and first semester, can develop peer networks and friendships, create links with academic members of staff, provide key information, inform realistic expectations, John again, improve academic skills, develop student confidence, and nurture a sense of belonging. And I think that for me that sums up quite a lot of things. Engaging in the academic project is really important, and nurturing a sense of belonging and identity and so on. So just to point you to the little article by Weinstein, without a W, it would have been Einstein, that was a great name to have, who did some research about interventions, and they wanted to see whether the early symbolic interactionist view, which used to think about how teachers' expectations of individual students could raise or suppress those students' aspirations and performances. So they were involved in an action research project in a school, actually, not a university, in the States. And they found that it needed a collaborative context in order to raise expectations and achieve them. So that was a 2-year project, and again I'll quote, the project over 2 years revealed perceived constraints emanating from deficits in students, pessimism about efficacy, and fears about exposing vulnerability in teachers and lack of support for collaborative action. So a very kind of negative start, okay? But over time, collaboration enabled participants to challenge these beliefs, thereby opening the door for disconfirming evidence. And so reframing expectations, reframing belief in oneself through collaborative activity. And that comes back to this social practice theory that I was talking about. So I think we need to, so I'm trying to link to this hard times business, and particularly marketization. The danger is that we begin to think about students as individual consumers who must be satisfied as a consumer in the same way as a consumer of a can of beans is. So I'd like to help us to think beyond expectations as individual consumers in this new environment that we're in and we're moving into, to expectations and aspirations of greater experience and success. And for staff, moving beyond this kind of new managerial, this ratchet effect, towards, similarly, a collaborative culture of success, which it sounds very much like you already have here in Derby. But realistic is key as well. The Pareto Principle. The Pareto Principle says you get 80% of your output from 20% of the things, whether they be plants or people or students and so on. In other words, some are really highly productive and others, not because they're lazy or whatever necessarily, but for other reasons. So, you know, we need to be realistic. I don't know whether Pareto's principle really works, but I think the caution that it offers is important. And Cherich and Sabatier, of course, their cautions that they were offering earlier on that I listed also need to be thought about. keeping the goals stable over time, having a good theory of change and so on. Okay, well, I've talked for about 20 minutes. Something for you to do now. If you look in your pack, you'll see a green sheet. And I was talking about expectations coming from other people or other sources, whereas aspirations normally are internal to institutions or people. Now, the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency, responsible for auditing culture in the UK, has just developed its quality code, a new quality code, which consists, it's like a book, it consists of chapters. One of the chapters is about student engagement, and I'm going to go on in the next section to talk about student engagement a bit. Okay, I want to move then to the student engagement projects that I mentioned, and really just pull out what we mean by student engagement. Because I think that QAA thing only concentrates on the second of three kind of dimensions of student engagement. The first one is the key one for me, engagement in individual student learning, or learning in the classroom. The second one is about structure and process, in other words, representative systems, the kinds of course committees or involvement with Senate of students and so on. And then the third one is about student identity, which is also really crucial. Do students feel part of the institution? Do they feel part of the course? Do they feel part of the discipline? Do they have a sense of ownership? That was mentioned in a couple of the studies that I've just been talking about, that sense of community identity. And some colleagues of mine, including Paul Ashwin in my department, have just finished an ESRC project looking at sociology departments in a number of universities. And what they found, tracking students, undergraduate students over time, was that as they engaged in student learning in an engaged way, as they engaged with the knowledge, their identity changed. So at the end of the program, they became different people. They thought differently. Their perspective on the world was different, which is, of course, something that we would hope. So these things aren't separate. They're very much one supports the other. And I would like to argue that the structure and process one, like HEFCE getting together with the NUS and students in institutions, student bodies in institutions, being involved with decision-making in the institution, is also really important. So although we've identified three, we shouldn't think of them as separate. And they also have different axes, if you like. There's what students do, the behavioral axis. There's the emotional one. Shouldn't going to university be fun? To paraphrase one of today's workshops, absolutely. And then there's the cognitive one, the engagement with the knowledge and so on, that Paul Ashwin and that project about undergraduate inequality and quality was concerned with. And you might find that students can be engaged, and we hope so, in a way that is congruent with institutional aims and expectations and so on. But they can also be engaged in a way which is oppositional. They can challenge, as students did when the fee regime came in and the marches in London and so on. They're damn well engaged, but they're just not agreeing with where you are. So, we don't also need to think necessarily of engagement involving the straight A student. It might be the student who says, well, why do we have 3-hour written exams? That's just not appropriate. But of course, non-engagement is something that is not desirable. Here's a couple of three, actually, I think, real-world examples. Improving student engagement. Do you think that is student engagement? Actually, I don't think so myself. You might disagree, again. Or this one. This is an advert for a clicker system, where students vote on things or press their answers. Are you looking for a way to increase student engagement and learning in your class? Is that collaborative? Is there peer support? All the things I've been talking about. I don't think so, but you might disagree. So we've got a market model of student engagement on the horizon, where students are engaged in the sense that they do a student satisfaction survey to say whether they liked the product that they bought for £9,000 a year or whatever it is. Or we've got a developmental model of student engagement. And this, I rather like this stages of engagement by May, which moves along a spectrum from consultation to involvement to participation to partnership. And that partnership one, I think, is, in terms of aspirations, is one where we might think our aspirations institutionally and as individuals might lie. I would like to think so, and that certainly seems to be the way that HEFG is thinking in terms of its involvement with the NUS. Here's an example of the market model from the Guardian Higher Education Network of all places. I thought they could have done better than this. 5 rules of student engagement for effective marketing. And here, if you can't see it, you might be able to see it better on the other screens. How can you ensure a captive audience for your university's key marketing messages? Is that student engagement? I don't know. So I'm having to go quite quickly now. It's 1:45. So some pointers, and there's a lot of evidence. There's an awful lot of work being done on, working with students, collaborating with them, engaging them in partnership, and so on, particularly in the States, the United States. So the Documenting Effective Educational Practices, the DEEP project. It's available on the web. The link is at the end of the slides. Lots of handbooks and so on available there, and I do think they're really effective. And you'll see a lot of these things that they identify in terms of their principles for engagement accord with what I've been trying to say and with what John started with at the beginning. Shared understanding of institutional mission and philosophy. Strong sense of community, of course that ties in to what the What Works project said about engaging students right from the start to develop a sense of community, a sense of friendships and so on. We are people after all. We like to have friendships. We like to feel comfortable. We like to have good affective responses to things. Students having a prominent voice in campus governance, and so on. You can read for yourself. Again, if there's anything you want to pick up, I'm going quickly because I want to leave time for questioning at the end. But I think this is a nice checklist of some of the things that we should be aspiring to institutionally, departmentally, in terms of our courses, and so on. And when they talk about leadership, again, I just stress what I said at the beginning. We're all leaders, we're all followers. Some quotes from the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education funded study. That, you remember the 3 institutions that were strong on engagement. This one from a student leader. And they, in the interview, stressed how important having members of the top team who were on board with trying to involve students as partners, to have a voice, to be co-producers in all aspects of their education and the university. And so there was a commonality about that mission, about that set of aspirations in that institution, which obviously I can't name. Here's a senior manager in one of the 3 institutions. Starts with a power relationship and then builds into something more positive. You can't wish away the power relationships between, for example, academics and their students, but you can work at diminishing their negative effects. And we identified in that project, that Leadership Foundation for Higher Education project, some success factors. And here are some of them. There's a couple of slides of this. again, I'll just let you read them for a second. GOAT and goal. Go out and talk. Go out and listen. Actually get involved. I was at another conference and one of the student delegates said, when I was talking about having a student engagement survey rather than a student satisfaction survey, they said, we're sick to the back teeth of surveys and evaluation forms and so on. Talk to us, listen to us. And I think there's a lot of, we all feel that too. Oh, an evaluation form, another one. Can't buy anything now and you have to fill in an evaluation form. Okay, I think those speak for themselves. I'll press on to the next slide, second one on this. Reviewing procedures. Thinking about the tools. Going back to social practice theory. Are the proformas? Proformas are tools, and they're really important ones that you're using. For example, peer review of teaching and so on. They structure the way you see things and what you do with them. Closing the feedback loop, not only taking the views of students and others, but then showing them that you've actually made a change. Trying to see things from the student's perspective. Consistent messages from senior management and from leaders in general. And again, that goes back to Cherich and Sabatier's stable goals. Not being a manager, the idea of the suit. Again, trying to disrupt the power relations. And those are often instantiated in symbolic things like suits and so on. Replacing a culture of compliance with a culture of permission, tolerating mess and uncertainty. And that was really true of the three-year strategic development project that I was talking about earlier on in that institution in England. And finding the right people, getting for example, the senior managers who were on board with the student partnership project and that set of aspirations, really important. So just to make a few final comments then, I think the bridge metaphor is really quite important if you're thinking about raising expectations and setting realistic ambitions, realistic aspirations. In other words, going from thinking a lot about where we are now as well as where we want to get to. Because where we can get to is conditioned in many, many ways by current situation. Karl Marx said something about men and women do not make their own history, they make it under conditions set by the past. And that's absolutely true. So this links to what I was saying before about adaptation rather than adoption. And in designing the bridge from here to the future, I think three things are really important, and I also nowadays can only deal with three things, and keep three things in my mind at once. I used to be able to deal with five, but we all get old, unfortunately. So the three things are salience, congruence, and profitability. Salience, does it matter to you? If it doesn't really matter to you, then it's not going to really work, unless in some way you can change what matters to you. And what are the dimensions of it that matter to you? Congruence, will it fit to where we are now? And I could, if I had more time, give you some examples of really successful projects that worked, I think, because, well, at least according to the authors of those of the studies, that worked because the innovation was congruent with the current context. And profitability, not in terms of money, of course, because there's not much of that around nowadays, but in terms of what matters to the people involved. For academic staff, it's usually time. Anything, any innovation, any new project, if it's going to involve more of their time, they're not going to be terribly comfortable with it. So how to fail? If you want to fail in making innovations, in raising aspirations, setting new goals, look for single right answers. There's never a single right answer. See innovations in teaching and learning and assessment practices in isolation from lecturers' identities, ideologies, and current practices. By ideologies, I mean educational ideologies. What are they doing it for? People talk about, not invented here, people talk about reinventing the wheel. I think reinventing the wheel is actually a very good thing because when you invent it yourself, it's your wheel. and it's adapted to your context. So feeling that it was invented here is really quite a good thing. Think about, if you want to fail, think about individuals, don't think about groups, and forget about, as the quote from Marx just suggested, history, context, process. It's really important where people are coming from, what stories they are telling each other, and so on. And in terms of social practice theory, think about the tools that you're using, artifacts in general, like PowerPoint, like whatever it is in your particular area of work. The goals clear but adaptable, as I say, adaptation. Good practice on the ground and working with that. So much now there's a discourse of derision. You know, staff aren't good enough, doctors aren't good enough, nobody's good enough anymore. And that's you know, healthcare isn't good enough, and so you could go through the thing. Largely driven by the media, but also by politicians who are using it for their own ends. That's really sad. So find good practice and then build on that, work with that. And again, that relates to salience, congruence, and profitability, thinking about the current context. And the theory of change business that Cherich and Sabatier suggested was really important. And what to expect? Well, I've already mentioned some of these. Different outcomes in different locales. It's more about market gardening than agribusiness, if you see the metaphor. Certainly in universities with their different cultures, different disciplines, and so on. Expect, of course, resistance and reconstruction locally. Expect the project's meaning to develop as the people work on it, and that has to do with groups, you know, creating, constructing meaning over time. And that messages will be read in different ways. Rumors will develop, and things will grow that have no basis in reality, stories, but will actually they'll be real in their effects. And so that's one of the reasons why going out and talking, going out and listening is really important. So I'm going to skip to the online resources. They're all available. They're including a Sakai. Sakai is a Web 2.0 kind of interactive platform, which we've set up about student engagement, our findings, and so on. The NUS engagement toolkit is there, and the deep project guides that I mentioned are there also. And the general reports from the 7 projects in the retention and success, the what works findings that I mentioned are there. And I'll stop with about 4 minutes only, I'm sorry, but there's the panel later for questions. Thank you.